بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم اغفر لنا ولشيخنا ولجميع المسلمين. قال المؤلف رحمه الله: باب مسح الخفين. يجوز يوما وليلة ولمسافر ثلاثة بلياليها من حدث بعد لبس على طاهر مباح ساتر للمفروض يثبت بنفسه من خف وجورب صفيق ونحوهما.
الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء أشرف المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين، أما بعد. Today we want to focus on the mas'ala of masah ala jawrabayn, to make the masah, to wipe over what would be called socks, and we'll differentiate between different types of socks. In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they had what we'll call khuff. Al khuff, when you have two of them, that's called khuffan. If it's in a halat al majroor, in linguistically, then it's khuffain. Masah ala khuffain. Why khuffain? Because ala harf jar. This also brings out the point that what is al khuff. So before we get into a discussion of a mas'ala, we should always realize the ta'rif, or what is the definition and the introduction of what we're discussing. And today I'm just going to talk about one mas'ala, masah ala jawrabayn. This on what issue we're going to spend the dars. Why? Because this is a very important mas'ala, and many people make very foolish comments about it, very ignorant comments about it. So I want to make sure that at least the discussion that goes on is based on a proper understanding of the language and the dala'il and the aqwal of the madahib, so that at least you can know what you're talking about. Imam al-Zubaydi and other imma of al-lugha, Imam al-Zubaydi has a famous book, Taj al-Urus, he's famous, or the book al-Misbah or Lisan al-Arab. These are our go-to books to go back and look at the definition of what words mean. Because today we may define words in a way that were not used in the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's why Ibn Athir and Ibn Jawzi has books called Gharib al-Hadith, why it tells you those words that are not commonly used. When I went to look up the word khuff, you will find it in the dictionaries across the board. Imam al-Biyuti, the famous Mansur al-Biyuti, in Rawat al-Murbi' has also explained it, and also in his Sharh al-Muntaha, and he says, ما يلبس على رجله الرجل من الجلد, what a man wears or a person can wear on their feet that's made out of leather. So what is a khuff? By definition, al-khuff or khuffan or khuffain, depending on how you're using it, it is what is made out of leather. So I have brought today examples, inshallah. This is a khuff. Tayyib? One khuff. If we had two, this would be khuffan. Tayyib? If you put something to make it majroor, then khuffain. This is something that was worn in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to protect the foot. It was not worn just to make masah, but it was used, and we talked about it in the last dars. Now, before I continue on to the jawrab and jarmuq and khirqa and all those other things that I'm going to define today, understand something. In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was not exactly like this. Tayyib? Because I keep hearing the jawrab today is not like the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Well, neither is a khuff, because here I have a zip, right? It's a high quality Pakistani khuff, right? They have a zip, and I have what we call the titch button, right? It locks like this, right? Do you think they had this in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? No. But why is it that ulama, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, across the board still allow you to make masah on this? Because they say, well, even though it's not exactly the way it was in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but this falls under the definition of a khuff, because it is worn on the foot to protect the foot, to keep it warm, to whatever reason you want to protect your foot from the elements, and it's made out of leather. So what is this? A khuff. You can make masah on this ijma'an, like by the consensus of the Muslim ummah, you can make masah on it. We mentioned that Imam Ahmad said there's 40 ahadith on it. Some Imam said 50 or 70 aqwal from, including the aqwal of Sahaba and so on and so on. Tayyib. That's a khuff. In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they also had what's called al-jawrab. Jawrab. But it was different. Now, when I tried to look up the definition of jawrab, I found something very interesting. One of my go-to books, it's called Mutli' ala al-alfaz al-muqni'. Al-Mutli' ala al-alfaz al-muqni' of al-Ba'li, the great Nahwi, the scholar of Nahw, and mashallah, amazing scholar. It's a good book to have. So he mentions that this is a kalimat ajami, mu'rab. Yani, jawrab is not an Arabic word originally. It is a ajami, it is a non-Arabic word that became a part of the Arabic language. Tayyib. So now what is a jawrab? Az-Zubaydi in Taj al-Urus does mention al-jawrab is whatever is worn on the foot made out of suf or the likes to protect it. And al-Misbah and other dictionaries give a similar definition. So this is something different. Ibn Hazm in al-Muhalla, he mentions many things that a jawrab can be made of. He said that this is something that covers the foot. It can be made out of wool or linen or felt or cotton or fur or hair. In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, camel hair was used sometimes to make thread, and that would be used. So what is jawrab? It is like the khuff, except by definition, it is not leather. It can be made out of any of these other elements that we mentioned, including wool, hair, these types. Most of the time, like in the later time, you see cotton is used to make socks. So we're going to define these as leather socks, al-khuff, and non-leather socks. Now, we hear all the time that the jawrab today is not like the jawrab of the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Tayyib. But does that mean that the hukm is not applicable? No, because like we said, even the khuff of today is not exactly manufactured and made like the khuff of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but as long as it's leather and it covers the foot, it comes under the hukm. So by definition, al-jawrab is going to be made out of things like cotton, made out of things like wool. In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they had them made out of wool. Ibn Athir and others have explained this. So what does that mean? That today if you get a sock and it's made of other than leather, then it will be a jawrab. Now, can you make masah on it? Now this depends. And this is why I brought a few examples in. Because the ignorance of people is such that they don't like to research. So we get these little comments, oh, all the four madahib agree you can't make masah on a jawrab. What? This is ignorance. This is, jahl. Or the jawrab in our time is different. Well, what do you mean different? Well, they're thinner. Well, not all of them. In fact, we have jawraban, with two iskum jawraban, jawarib is their jama', that are probably better. They're made with more enduring materials than the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we have some that are lighter and thinner and not as good as the ones in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because of technology, we have this span of what's called a jawrab has increased. So now which one can you make masah and which one you cannot? We'll discuss that. But first I just want to introduce the concept of what a jawrab is. I did some additional research. I spent a lot of time on this. And I found that the word jawrab, it came from a Persian word, gawrab, with a gaf. It's a different, which became jawrab. And many languages that have words of Persian in them today, you hear juraba, jurabe, so on and so on, derivative from the same. But this is originally from an old classic Persian word, gawrab. Gawrab actually came from an Aramaic word. just to understand. And it was girab. And what it meant was a pouch for the foot. A pouch for the foot. This is where the original of this word came. In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because of wool and hair and fur being used, when those materials, as Ibn Hazm and ulama across the board have explained, Al-Biyuti and others, when they use things like suf, yani wool, to make anything that protects the foot, that stays on the foot, then this would be called al-jawrab. There are two other definitions I want to give before we get into the mas'ala. One is al-khirqa, or khirq, as if you use the jama' of it. Mufrad is al-khirqa and the jama' is khirq. And this would be what we would call rags, like just a piece of cloth that you take and you wrap around your foot or your hand or whatever else. Ijma'an, by the consensus of the ulama of Islam, you cannot make masah on this. Khirqa, if you just take, like for example, I take this piece of cloth and I just wrap it around my foot, right? I just wrap it. And it, as soon as I start walking, it could fall right off, right? Ijma'an, you cannot make masah on this. Why? As Al-Biyuti and others have mentioned, there is no dalil for it. Rasulullah didn't make masah on it. It does not meet the definition of al-jawrab, because a jawrab would be something made as a sock that stays on. It stays on your foot by itself. Yani, al-khirqa, you could take a cloth and tie it and put it, but then as soon as you start walking, it'll fall apart or in a little while. So that would not be permissible either. Then there is jurmuq or jurmuqun, you can make both jama' of it. That was, Al-Jawhari mentions that it was something that was worn over the khuff. This was like what we would call a boot or a shoe in a way. It would be worn on top of either Jawrabayn or the khuff. And here you can make masah on them as long as it or what's under it covers the ankles. طيب? We'll get into the masail and the adilla in a minute. طيب. Now we get to the issue of jawrab. In our time, we have different types of socks. This is one example I brought. This is my own sock. طيب. This is, I'm assuming, wool, cotton, whatever. But this will be under jawrab. Now, this is a sock that's meant for sports and hiking and things. So even if I to stretch it, it has this elastic, whatever plastics in it. You can't see the skin even if I stretch it. And it's double soled. So I have personally, as an experiment, walked 3 miles in these. Just as a personal experiment. And they're still intact. All right? Just letting you know. On an average street, I mean, not on soft grass or whatever. So these types of socks, you can walk in without a problem, right? They are thick, they protect the foot, they stay on by themselves, and this is one type of sock. Jawrab will never be waterproof. By definition, when you make something out of wool, it is not waterproof. Then you have these. I have never worn these. They're a little feminine, but I brought these just as an example. These are also socks in our time. Now, there's a couple of issues with these for masah. One is that it doesn't cover your ankle, but that's not the point. The point is, if you look at it, you see it's very, very thin. You can see my skin easily through it. And you could not walk in these by themselves. If you start walking, these will rip right away. These are meant to be under shoes, I guess, or whatever. But these are also called jawrab. But these, by the Jamhur al-Ulama, you cannot make masah on. Now, as I said, these ones, as an example, do not cover your ankle. So ijma'an, you couldn't make masah on these. But if you say, if you had this type of a sock, that is this type of a thin material, and it did cover your ankle, according to the madahib al-arba'ah, you could not make masah on these because they expose that which has to be protected. I will not say ijma'an, because the Zahiri madhab has a qawl that even thin socks you can make masah on, but you can say what is the Jamhur al-Ulama and the majority, which is the madhab al-arba'ah, on these types of socks, you could not make masah on. Tayyib. Now, let's get to the issue of the hukam and the khilaf and the adillah. Everybody clear on the definitions? Tayyib. According to Al-Mundhari and others, you will find Ibn Qattan and others have mentioned ijma' that you cannot make masah on thin socks. But as I said, this is a flawed statement because there is the Zahiri madhab and those who followed them, Ibn Hazm and others, that allowed making masah on thin socks. But when you go to the madahib al-arba', the four well-known madahib, Tayyib, Hanafi madhab, the Maliki madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, the Hanbali madhab, all four of them allow you to make masah on Jawrabayn. But all of them have certain conditions. Tayyib? But the first thing to understand, because I'm very, I don't know what to say, I'm very perturbed by some of what I read and see, because I see people say things like, in the Hanafi madhab, you can only make masah on the leather socks. And in the same article, they talk about, well, in the Hanafi madhab, you could make masah on Jawrabayn, but they have to meet these conditions. Wait. So either you say that you can only make masah on leather socks, you cannot make masah on the jawrab, or you say you can make masah on the jawrab, but there are certain conditions. So these are two different statements. So don't misrepresent a madhab. Tayyib? According to all four of the madahib, you can make masah on Jawrabayn. How do I make this claim? I want to mention, inshallah, some of the aqwal of each of the madahib. Let's begin first with the Hanafi madhab. When you study the Hanafi madhab, you need to always go back to the original books like Mukhtasar al-Quduri, which is called Al-Kitab, and that's how respected it is in Hanafi madhab. Even when they have shuruh of it, they show Al-Lubab fi Sharh al-Kitab. Or you go to Al-Hidayah, which is one of the standard books. But if you want to know the mu'tamid of the Hanafi madhab, then the Hashiyah of Ibn Abidin, which is called Radd al-Muhtar, on the Radd al-Mukhtar. So Radd al-Muhtar is the Hashiyah of Ibn Abidin. Ibn Abidin's Hashiyah, this is the final book to go to in the Hanafi madhab. Ibn Abidin in his Hashiyah, he writes that according to the two, which is Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani and Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf, you can make masah on the Jawrabayn that are thick. Tayyib? And he said Abu Hanifa also changed his view, and this is the madhab. So, anybody that says that the only thing you can make masah in the Hanafi madhab is the leather khuff is a liar. I'm sorry to say it so bluntly. Hopefully I don't offend anybody. And if I do, sorry. I even brought one of the books, and I couldn't bring all the books that I looked up for this, but I brought one book, and this is called Al-Hidayah. Al-Hidayah is a well-known book of Hanafi fiqh. If you've ever studied Hanafi fiqh, you will know this book well. And I brought a print from Pakistan, just in case people don't say that some Wahhabi in Saudi changed the print or something. So this is Al-Hidayah, Maktaba al-Bushra from Karachi. In Al-Hidayah, this is the Maktaba al-Bushra, Jild al-Awwal, first Jild, and this is the 107th page. All right, just saying. It says لا يجوز المسح على الجوربين عند أبي حنيفة إلا أن يكون مجلدين. So the first thing we see here is that it is not permissible to make masah on the Jawrabayn according to Abu Hanifa unless they are leather, unless they have leather. Or muna'alayn. Na'alayn has two meanings. One is a sock that has a leather sole, like what we would call in America moccasins. Moccasins have a leather sole. This was called na'alayn too, for na'alayn. It's also called for a slip-on shoe that would go on top of the jawrab, like a slipper. But here the meaning is for the one that have the leather soles. وَقَالَ. Who is qala? The two said, Abu Yusuf Qadi Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani. Yajuz. It is permissible as long as they are thick and do not expose the skin. طيب? So, according to the Mu'tamid of the Hanafi madhab, right? We find this. Then we have in Al-Hidayah, وعنه يعني upon Abu Hanifa, أنه رجع. He made ruju' إلى قولهما, to the qawl of the two, meaning Abu Hanifa changed his view to the view of the other two. وعليه فتوى. This is very important. وعليه فتوى. What does that mean? That this is the mu'tamid view of the Hanafi madhab, that you can make masah on thick socks that do not show the skin. In Hidayah, you do not find anything about 3 miles or 2 miles or a distance. This is all that there is from the original imma of the Hanafi madhab. Now, I brought another book with me. I couldn't bring all my books, but I brought a couple. This is the Jami' of Imam al-Tirmidhi. In the Jami' of Imam al-Tirmidhi, where the hadith regarding masah al-khuffayn is there is a hadith, yani it is with a sanad regarding Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh. طيب. Jami' al-Tirmidhi, go to the bab ما جاء في مسح على جوربين ونعلين, after the hadith, and we'll discuss the hadith later, just explaining the Hanafi madhab right now. After the hadith, Imam al-Tirmidhi mentions, وقال أبو عيسى, يعني Imam al-Tirmidhi said, سمعت صالح ابن محمد الترمذي. Imam al-Tirmidhi, Abu Isa al-Tirmidhi, he heard from Salih ibn Muhammad al-Tirmidhi, قال سمعت أبا مقاتل, I heard from Abu Muqatil al-Samarqandi, يقول, now very short sanad here, and he says, I said, دخلت على أبي حنيفة, I entered upon Abu Hanifa في مرضه, يعني when he was during his sickness, الذي مات فيه, and the one that he died from. Yani this is the end of the life of Abu Hanifa, yani this is his final view. وَدَعْ بِمَاءٍ, so he asked for water, فَتَوَضَّعَ, and he made wudu'. وَعَلَيْهِ جَوْرَبَانِ, and he was wearing جَوْرَبَانِ. فَمَسَحَ عَلَيْهِمَا, so he made masha on them. ثُمَّ قال, then he said, فَعَلْتُ الْيَوْمِ شَيْئًا, I did something today, لَمْ أَكُنْ أَفْعَلَهُ, and what I used to not do. مسحت, يعني I made مسحة على الجوربين وهما غير منعلين. So they were not na'alain, they did not have the leather soles, they did not have a slipper over them. They were not khuff, they were jawrabayn, made out of other than leather, socks, wool, cotton, whatever else, but they were what we call regular socks. And Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh, before his death, he held the view you can make masah on them, and he did so himself and told people that I didn't used to allow this, but now I allow it. So he made ruju', raja'a, he made ruju' to the qawl of the other three. So all three of the a'imma, from the great a'imma that were the asas of the Hanafi madhab, Imam Abu Hanifa himself, Imam Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani, Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf, all of them agreed you can make masah on thick socks. Now, having said that, later Hanafi ulama put some conditions. And to be fair, I'm going to mention them. Tayyib? For example, that you find in some of the later books of the Ahnaf, that one of the shart they said they have to be tahir and lawful, that's fine. They should be worn in a state of wudu, everybody agrees on that. They should cover both ankles completely, no problem with that. They should be durable enough that a person can walk in them for 3 miles without them being torn. This is one of the conditions that some of the later... Now, these are not proven for Abu Hanifa, Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani or Qadi Abu Yusuf. But some later imam for the Ahnaf, they put this. They should be independently free from holes to the extent that 3 toes cannot fit in them, meaning they should not have a hole bigger than 3 toes. And they should remain on the leg without having to be readjusted and fastened and so on. And they should be that water cannot easily seep through them. This does not mean they're waterproof. Tayyib? No jawrab in the time of Rasulullah ﷺ could have been waterproof. Today, one of the most foolish things that's just a pet peeve of mine is people come up, brother, I have come with a jawrab that you can make. They market it called the wudu socks. Google, you can find wudu socks. What are they? Seal skin. They have this special coating on them with silicone coating so that water doesn't get through. Do you think the Sahaba were sitting around with silicone coat? I mean, seriously, do you think that the jawrab in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, made out of camel hair, made out of wool, would have been waterproof? Like what the Sahaba time traveled and got seal coating for silicone and went back? And how do you make wool waterproof other than leather? And then it's a khuff, right? So this is what is the meaning of the madhab here, and the Shafi'is as well, is they should not be so thin that as soon as you put the water, it touches the skin. According to them, they should be thicker, so when you put the water, it doesn't immediately seep through. Jawrab will never be waterproof, but they should be thick enough that water doesn't sink fastly through them. Having said that, many of the Hanafi ulama, like Imam al-Asr as he's called, Muhammad Anwar Shah Kashmiri and Yusuf Binuri and others, they disagreed with these fatwa. Imam al-Kashmiri, for example, he said that the idea of 3 miles has no basis in it. He said that this is something that should only be said that a person will be able to walk in them without them slipping off. This is the conditions of the Hanafi madhab. Let's go to the Maliki madhab. According to the Maliki madhab, there is the books of the Maliki madhab that are well known, like Mudawwana, where in Mudawwana it mentions that there are 2 aqwal of Imam Malik. Ibn Abdul Barr in his Shuruh has also mentioned this. One of them that you cannot make masah on the Jawrabayn, but this is not the fatwa of the Maliki madhab. What is mu'tamid in the Maliki madhab? That you can make masah on the Jawrab, as Mudawwana mentions, and the Hashiyah for Dusuqi, which is a book called Sharh al-Kabir. These are the mu'tamid books of the Maliki madhab. But according to the Maliki madhab, it should have leather on top and bottom. And this is the opinion of the Maliki madhab. Yani, what faces the sama and what faces the ard, on top and bottom. Some of the Malikiyah said that this means that if they were na'alayn, and they had leather soles and so on, you can make masah on them. Some said no, the top and the bottom both have to be. Some said they have to be covered and so on. This is the opinion of the Maliki madhab. Tayyib, when we go to the Shafi'i madhab, and again there are many aqwal within the Shawafi', but Imam al-Nawawi, he mentioned some that they should be tahir and lawful, they should be worn in a state of wudu', they should cover both ankles completely, they should be durable enough that a person can walk in them without mentioning any mileage, without mentioning any distance. And he said they should be independently free from holes. So unlike, Adam, I want to change that. Unlike the Hanafi madhab, which allowed there to be a hole up to 3 toes, in the Shafi'i madhab it should have no holes at all, and they should remain on the leg independently. I mean, they should not be like the khirqa that falls off, and they should be that the water does not seep through them easily. Once again, this is not to say they have to be waterproof, but rather thick enough that water doesn't immediately seep through them. Tayyib, this is the Shafi'i madhab. Now we get to the Hanabila, because many people say all 4 madahib say they have to be waterproof or water cannot seep. This is not true. That's another lie. The Hanabila, as Ibn Qudama has mentioned, as Imam al-Bihouti in his Shuruh and so on, they said that they should be tahir and mubah, lawful. They should be worn in a state of wudu'. They should cover the whole foot, including the 2 ankles completely. They should be durable enough that a person can walk in them without any distance being meant. And they should remain on the leg, unlike the khirqa who falls apart. And they should be free from any major holes that expose the skin. Very clearly, the Hanabila, they mention that they do not need to be waterproof. Imam al-Taghlabi, for example, the famous Hanbali scholar, in his Sharh of Dalil al-Talib, he clearly says that they do not need to be waterproof. Abu al-Farj, which is the famous scholar, Ibn Jawzi, and other Imam have also pointed this out. Ibn Qudama, for example, he mentions this, that they do not need to be water resistant, waterproof. This is not a shart on the Hanabila. Tayyib? So these are the aqwal of the A'imma and ulama. All of the 4 madahib allow there to be masah on the Jawrabayn, but each one has its own shurut. Tayyib? So let's now talk about adilla, proofs. طيب. First and foremost, we have the hadith that again, I brought a Tirmidhi, so I will read it directly from the book. This is in the bab of ma ja'a al-masah ala jawrabayn. Imam at-Tirmidhi here, he mentions the hadith from Mughira ibn Shu'bah that tawadda an-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa masaha ala jawrabayn wa na'layn. Now, na'layn, as I said, there is a definition that is used, that is a sock that has a leather sole on the bottom. There is also that it's a shoe slipper that slips on. Like in Hajj, when we talk about na'layn, we talk about slip-on shoes. The mistake a lot of people make is they say, oh, you can make masah on the jawrabayn, but the hadith says only when they're na'layn. That is not what the hadith says. Read the hadith again. وَمَسَحَ عَلَى الجَّوْرَبَيْنِ وَنَعْلَيْنِ ليس الجوربين وهم أو هما منعلين لا يعني these are two different things. The Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made masah on the jawrab and the na'layn. Yani if your socks are na'layn, meaning they do have leather soles, you can make masah on them. But this is not giving a sifa of the jawrabayn. If you know Arabic, when you give the sifa of something, then they have to be put together without the waw. There's no atf there. Sifa, then you have to make sure that they're both the same sigha. For example, if you say one munakkaran, then it has to be munakkar, it has to be ma'aruf, then ma'aruf, and you know how sifa works. This is not giving sifa of the jawrabayn, rather saying jawrabayn and waw, al-atf, and na'layn. Two different things. Both can be made mashan. This hadith is reported by Imam at-Tirmidhi. Imam at-Tirmidhi here said, هذا hadith hasanun sahihun. Now, having said that, there are a'imma and ulama that criticize this hadith, including Imam Ahmad himself. But there is no criticism of the narrators. There is no weak, these narrators, as Ibn Mulaqqin, who's also known as Ibn Nahwi, and other a'imma and ulama have pointed out that these are Rijal al-Bukhari. And these are the reporters from Sahih al-Bukhari. There is no weakness in the narrators. The issue is some of the a'imma saw the hadith of Mughira ibn Shu'bah that he mentioned the masah on the khuff and the imama. So they thought maybe that what was meant here was khuff, and Mughira ibn Shu'bah, he made a mistake by saying jawrabayn. Tayyib, that does not weaken the hadith any from a hadith, from a sanad perspective or a rawi perspective, but you could say there is a illah in this, as some of the ulama have said. Having said that, Shaykhuna Albani and other a'imma and ulama in their takhrij have graded this hadith to be sahih, as did Imam at-Tirmidhi. But Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, as somebody mentioned that he saw illah in this hadith, he still took that hukam. Why? Because of the, as Imam Ahmad mentioned, the 7 or 8 clear sahih narrations from the Sahaba for making masah ala jawrabayn. See, now the weakness that could have been that hadith is mitigated by this. Why? Because in the hadith, if we thought maybe there was a switch of words, but then from the af'al, from the actions of the Sahaba, we see that masah on the jawrabayn is proven. So there is no fear that a new mas'ala is being introduced. And I will mention those rawayat, and this is the book Nail al-Awthar of Imam al-Shawkani. And I have marked it because I wanted to mention from here those narrations with the authenticity of them, because this one that I have is an excellent taqreej work. So, عن مغيرة بن شعبة رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم توضأ ومسح على الجوربين والنعلين رواه الخمسة إلا النسائي وصححه الترمذي فقال هذا حديث صحيح. With it, قال أبو داود, Imam Abu Dawud, he mentions that مسح على الجوربين has been proven from Ali ibn Abi Talib, Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib رضي عنه. طيب. It has also been reported from Ibn Mas'ud and Barra ibn Azib and Anas ibn Malik and Abu Umama and Sahal ibn Sa'ad and Amr ibn Huwayrith and Rawa Dalik and Umar ibn Khattab or Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhum. طيب, how many is that now? Count with me. Ali ibn Talib. طيب. Is that, as we mentioned, these are what Imam Abu Dawud has mentioned. Ali ibn Talib, Ibn Mas'ud. Ibn Mas'ud rawaya, this is as Takhrij is mentioned, this is Sahih. I found it also in the Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, authentically mentioned. Tayyib, Barra ibn Azib, and Anas ibn Malik, Abu Umama, Sahl ibn Sa'ad. All of these now coming up to be what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right? As Imam Ahmad had mentioned. Also from Umar ibn Khattab and Anas ibn Malik. Regarding these narrations, for example, Anas ibn Malik, Ibn Mundhari had mentioned an Awsat from Qatada, from Anas ibn Malik, with a sanad that is Sahih. Regarding Bara ibn Azib, this is Ibn Mundhar in Al-Awsat, also mentioned that this is a Hasan, reliable narration. Regarding the Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, as I mentioned, Ibn Mundhar has in Al-Awsat and the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba with a Sahih sanad. Regarding Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, Ibn Mundhar also has this and also mentioned this to be a Sahih sanad. And so on. So what we find, Sahl ibn Sa'ad radiyallahu anhu, also mentioned by Ibn Mundhar with the Hasan riwayah. Tayyib. So what we find from these Abu Umama, for example, his narration as well from Ibn Mundhar, also a Hasan riwayah. We have at least 9 reliable Sahih and Hasan Maqbul ahadith from Sahaba for making masah on the Jawrabayn. Tayyib. Those who say you cannot make salah behind somebody who makes masah on regular socks, I wonder if they would make salah behind Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu anhu, behind the Sahaba, behind Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we see the hadith about masah on the Jawrabayn, sanadan sahih from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How do you make such a statement and so lightly, without understanding the mas'ala? If you say they have to be water resistant in your madhab, whatever, but Imam Ahmad, for example, in the Hanabila, clearly said that's not a shart. There is no dalil for this shart. You have to be able to walk in them, but there is no distance that is mentioned in any hadith. So if sock like this, if I have a sock like this, according to the Hanafi madhab, I can make masah on it. I have personally walked in this. Even if you take the 3 miles, I've walked 3 miles in these. And I can make masah on. They don't seep. Very simple, clearly, I can make masah on them. Socks that are very thin, yes, according to the madhab al-arba, you cannot make masah on them. That is understandable. But again, don't claim ijma'. Because even if some people had mentioned ijma', we know the Zahiri madhab allowed it. So when there is khilaf in the ummah, we do not call ijma' there. Tayyib, I'm going to stop here on just this summary. No doubt, masah on the Jawrabayn, which are made out of wool or cotton or hair or other than leather, have been mentioned from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yes, the Sahaba used to walk around in these, so they should be thick, and they shouldn't expose the skin underneath. That is correct. And if you wear the na'layn, if you wear slippers over them, you can make masah on them as long as the na'layn and the jawrabayn together cover the ankles. Or the jarmuq, or if you wear a shoe on top of it, as long as what's underneath it and with the shoe will cover the ankles and it's thick, you can make masah on them. There is a hadith, for example, closed it already. Regarding jarmuq, I also wrote down the hadith so that we can mention it. Regarding the jarmuq, Bilal radiyallahu anhu mentions توضع ويمسح النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم على عمامته وموقه رواه أبو داود فقال الموق والجرموق وقال الحاكم هو الصحيح ووافقه الذهبي. This tells us that Rasulullah has also been known to make masha on what is called the muq or the jarmuq, which is the shoe that's worn over the khuff, as long as it meets the criteria. Tayyib, the madahib and their shurut, I've mentioned them, but what do we find in adillah, proofs? We find that they should be thick because obviously Rasulullah used to walk around in them. In very thin socks, you will not be able to walk around. And the Sahaba walked around in them. Tayyib. But there is no distance, there's no 3 miles, there's no 1 mile, none of that is there. If you have socks that are thick enough that you can walk in them generally, meaning they're not going to fall apart as soon as you start walking, you can make masah on them bi adillah. And I have collected myself 9 of the aqwal of Sahaba, some of them that I've mentioned to you already, that clearly mention from authentic narrations that the Sahaba also made Jawrabayn. Ibn al-Qayyim and Imam Ibn Mundhar, the Shafi'i Ibn Mundhar, they make a very important point which I'm going to end with. They said the Sahaba from many ahadith made masah on the Jawrabayn, and nobody objected to it. Not a single Sahabi objected to it. And there is no dalil to say you cannot make masah on the jawrab. If you say it's not in the Quran, we say masah is in the Quran. Look at the different qira'at. If you say that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do it, we say yes, he did. There is a clear hadith in the Tirmidhi. Even if there was a fear of there being ilal in the matan, there is no problem with the sanad and the supporting narration from the Sahaba. Even Imam Ahmad accepted that as for his hukam. If you say that it was only one hadith, we say no, because a mawquf hadith is a hadith. There are 9 different Sahaba that did it, and not a single Sahabi that objected to it. So you can make masah on the jawrab as long as it meets what the criteria. They should cover the foot, including the ankles. To say 3 holes or 3 toes, there is no dalil for that. To say that you can make masah on socks that are filled with holes, find us a dalil. Saying of Sufyan al-Thawri or saying of an alim is not a dalil. You have to give a dalil, meaning from the Quran or Sahih Ahadith or Af'al al-Sahaba. If you find me a hadith that a Sahabi had a clear gaping hole and made masah on it, we'll talk. Until then, there's no dalil. So they should be free from holes. Not to say that they can. Obviously, this has holes. Even this khuff has holes where it's been sewn, but not a big hole where the skin is visible. On that type of a jawrab, if it's legally bought, meaning you didn't steal it, you got it through a halal way, and you put it on when you were in a state of wudu. You didn't just put it on without wudu, and you make masah on it for 1 day and night for the muqim and 3 days and their nights for the traveler. There is nothing wrong with that. This is established bi adillah and the aqwal of ulama. Wa jazakumullahu khairan.